what are Ukrainians saying about this situation is incredibly important, and it's what we need to be guided by. One of the things I find most dismaying in my debates with people and discussions with people is people who sort of throw up their hands and say, well, we can never know. You could talk to, one person and they'll say one thing, and you talk to somebody else and they'll say another thing, or there's so much propaganda, you can't really read through the propaganda. We should be careful what we say. Is Look, I think it's I believe objectively true, and I have no doubts about this, that in their massive majority, the Ukrainian people are unanimous in wanting to drive the Russians out of Ukraine. I have no doubts about that, and I believe that's true, across Ukraine, including in eastern Ukraine. And so, the question of where we place that kind of sentiment, that democratic sentiment on the part of a people that are facing military invasion, I think should be front and center in what we're talking about. And then, and not to go too far, we need to then think about specifically the history of Ukraine, and what's happened to the Ukrainian people over generations. That this experience of an imperial invasion, and one that very explicitly, if you look at Putin's speech from February of 2022, seeks to destroy and deny the agency and the history and the existence of Ukraine as a nation. And there's a long and sordid and complicated history of that. So when we talk about national self-determination in Ukraine, this isn't a 2022, 2023 problem. This is a long-standing historical dynamic, and its roots have resonance in amongst the Ukrainian people in their response to this invasion.
That's absolutely true, and a lot of these questions were really central questions that were being tackled over 100 years ago. The Bolsheviks, the Russian Revolution, the question of Ukraine, the prison house of nations, as the Russian Empire was known, the very concept of the left wing understanding of national self determination and the right of nations to self determination comes out of precisely that period. And what you're alluding to, Putin's speech that really inaugurated this war, was explicitly anti communist, anti Lenin, anti Bolshevik, in suggesting that Ukraine itself is merely a fiction, a creation of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, a ticking time bomb placed under Russia's feet to be, detonated in the future, right? So mixing together the classic anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes about the Bolsheviks and global conspiracy, while also combining that with an explicitly right-wing reactionary politics. And so I think we also need to be very clear that those elements on the left that find themselves defending this war and justifying it, even though they do it obliquely and tacitly in many ways, they are explicitly endorsing a right wing reactionary imperial revanchist war. Are they not?
Absolutely. I mean, 100% absolutely. And it's one of the most disturbing aspects of this, which is to think about the objective alignment of sections of the U.S. so-called peace movement with the Putin regime, and what that then means for the shape of politics, and the sort of excuse making, and kind of erasure of that erasures that happen in that context. We're this, whatever, without offering any excuses whatsoever for the United States and its history. The Putin regime represents one of the most frightening reactionary, regimes in the world, and harkens back to a long, anti-communist, imperial history, very explicitly. So people should be very clear of who they're getting in bed with, in these circumstances.
So, one of the questions that keeps coming up in debates on the left, and I'm constantly engaged in them. I wish that were not the case, but it is. One of the issues that keeps coming up is the issue of making demands. If you live in the United States and you're on the left, who are you to make a demand of Russia that Russia leave Ukraine? Russia doesn't care what you have to say. Your only job is to speak to what the US government should do or should not do, what the US government needs to stop doing. That's all you're supposed to talk about on the left, isn't it?
Right. I mean, that just I think that that grows out. That's a sort of distortion that grows out of the experience of the First World War, of Karl Liebknecht's call for the kind of the defeat of one's home imperialism, but in a very different context, in a context where the imperial countries were directly at war with one another. And it was never the case that the sole role of the left was to oppose one's own imperialism. Our role always was strategically to do what was best in defeating capitalism and the imperial world system. And this is why I think it's really important to focus strategically on why these solidarity efforts are not just about sort of abstract humanism or sort of blindness to the role of Western imperialism, but really grow out of a strategic imperative about how do we understand how we're going to build an international movement independent from the dominance of whatever nation states, independent from the dominance of the imperialist world system that can fundamentally challenge imperialism and its logic in all its forms. I think this is a profound moment for the left and marks a radical kind of reorganization in many ways for how the left is thinking and where people align themselves. This is not just about, unfortunately, this is not just about Ukraine. This is going to be really about how we choose to organize ourselves going forward in this new world order.
Ah, but Aaron, it is just like World War One. Don't you see? Russia's fighting a war against NATO. Putin said it himself, right?
Right. What aren't we talking about here? Who are we not talking about here? Right? We're not talking about Ukraine. We're not talking about the fact that the the NATO and the West and the US in particular have been very explicit and very careful about not being direct belligerents, not seeing an expansion of these wars. The United States, and Biden's been very explicit about this, has no interest in a direct military engagement with with Russia, and and what that logic, by reducing this invasion to simply one of kind of geopolitical machinations on the part of the imperial world system, does is it erases the reality on the ground in Ukraine, and it erases the kind of the agency and the desires of Ukrainians. And importantly, I think also kind of there's a real important opportunity here that we haven't had, that sections of the left have been attempting desperately to overcome, since the 1980s at least, if not earlier, which is the kind of impact of the Stalinist experiments in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, where unfortunately, broad sections of the popular movements in that part of the world have with illusions looked to the U.S. And looked to NATO as somehow inevitably their friends, and for understandable reasons, because they've lived under the threat of first Soviet repression, and now more recently Russian authoritarian rule. And we have to be in active engagement with these forces on the left and the trade unions and the forces of the movements of the national minorities, um, to have those conversations, and in this case the concrete engagement to have those conversations requires in the first instance a recognition of their agency and their needs, which is a desperate need to defend themselves in the face of the Russian invasion. We're not going to get a hearing if we stand back and say, and don't recognize what the call is, and simply say our only role here is to call out the machinations of the U.S. and NATO and the European Union. That can't be our only role, and to do so would be an enormous strategic mistake, and would cede potential, important allies for us, in going forward.
Now, last thing I want to just mention before we take a quick break, I want to talk about. Obviously, I was asking the previous questions a little bit tongue in cheek, to try to get at what is the real issue here for me, or at least one of the real issues on the left, and that is that broad sections of the left in the United States simply do not understand the fundamental nature of this war. They accept the framing as presented by Putin of a war between the Russians and NATO or the West, with all of the supporting information and documentation that is true. NATO is an imperial monster. NATO has expanded itself. There are constant, every year we see military exercises that are provocative near Russia's border. All of these things are true. But to accept the framing of this war as exclusively about that is to deny so many other aspects of the war. And I want to get your comment on this. Why is it that those sections of the left have no analysis of the Ukrainian oligarch class, the Russian oligarch class, the conflicts between those oligarchs that go back 30 plus years, the desire by Russian capital to seize Ukrainian capital? Where's the Marxist analysis? Where's the analysis of the economic situation of the last 30 years? Where are all of the different levels of analysis that we are supposed to go through to arriving at a sound conclusion politically? I don't see much of that work being done at all. Just a simple US, NATO bad, Russia lesser, Russia equals victim, I support Russia. It's as dumb as that.
The left is incredibly weak, and the absence of that analysis and the absence of that kind of that sort of multidimensional thinking and the kind of depth of historical understanding and knowledge which is really required in this circumstance is largely absent. And look, I mean, to be kind to I think living in the heart of the imperial beast as we do, we live in incredibly you know uh, as a general matter, people in the U.S. are incredibly largely ignorant about of happenings internationally. I have to say, and that includes people on the left. In a more positive sense, it is also true that that framework of U.S. bad, and I'm going to lead with that everywhere I go, made very real sense for generations. Certainly, through the period of the Cold War, through the period of the kind of unipolar moment that led to the Bush invasion of Iraq and the intervention in Afghanistan. There's a real logic to thinking in that way. So I don't want to be too cruel, but there is a way in which we need to now overcome that in this current circumstance. We need a different type of thinking, and the history is incredibly important. And understanding the kind of the depth of the theorizing on the left, going back to the 1930s and earlier, I think is really important. Also, these are not new questions for the left, even if it does feel like uncharted territory for us here in the United States today. Um, People need to go back and look at the history of Ukraine, look at the writings on the issue of national self-determination, the questions of colonialism, going back to the early part of the 20th century, Marxist writings on these questions, Marxist debates on these questions. I think for those of us coming out of the Trotskyist tradition, there's a really important document that Trotsky writes in 1938 called "Learn to Think," which he raises hypotheticals that are very, very concrete and applicable to this situation, right on the sort of precipice of the Second World War. Where he talks about a hypothetical where the Italian fascist regime is arming colonial rebels in Algeria against an ostensible democratic France. What do we say to workers in Italy? Should they stop the arms shipments to the rebels in Algeria? Because it's their fascist state, doing the arming. And Trotsky says absolutely not. Our starting point needs to be with the kind of the interests of the colonial rebellion in Algeria. You can read that or not read that, but there's an incredible history of writings on these issues that the left needs to reacquaint itself, desperately needs to reacquaint itself with.
Okay, let's take a quick break. On the other side of the break, I want to pick up talking a little bit about how we got to this point with this divide on the left, and more importantly, how we move forward. How do we develop a coherent set of demands, and how do we understand what peace would look like, what arming Ukraine is going to look like, is looking like, and much more to discuss with